in the Middle East if reforms aren't implemented. And she's been joined by Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, who says change in Egypt must be both peaceful and orderly.
It
is of vital importance to uphold the freedoms that we consider universal, like freedom of press, freedom of opinion, freedom of independent journalism, not only in Europe or America, but also in Egypt. Yesterday was relatively peaceful, and we hope it was a sign and will continue. There will be a change in Egypt, but it must be formed in a way that it will be peaceful and sensible.
Meanwhile, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron has been saying that Egypt needs change and reform in order to get stability.
On Egypt, our position should be clear. We want to see the transition to a more broadly based government with the proper building blocks of a free and democratic society. I simply don't accept that there is somehow a dead-end choice between a security state on the one hand and an Islamist one on the other. But let us not fool ourselves. These are just contributory factors. Even if we sorted out all of the problems that I've mentioned, there would still be this terrorism. And I believe the root lies in the existence of this extremist ideology. And I would argue an important reason so many young Muslims are drawn to it comes down to a question of identity.
Let's speak once again to Omar Ashur, who's a lecturer in the politics of the modern Arab world at the University of Exeter. We just heard there from a couple of Western leaders. Western governments still appear, by and large, to be mincing their words, largely echoing the words of Washington that a transition must begin, but stopping short of saying anything more that would lead to the immediate departure of President Hosni Mubarak. To what extent do you think Western governments are falling victim still to the kind of official narrative that has been coming out of Cairo, not just in the last few days, but over the last few decades, that if President Mubarak were to quit too suddenly, then the country could fall into the wrong hands, the hands of the Islamists?
Yeah, I think the role of Islamists is being overplayed here. The Muslim Brothers were not opposed this revolution for democracy in the beginning, and then they engaged with it with individuals only, and then a later stage they went behind it. What everybody is demanding in Egypt is a democratic transition, where you have a period of ruling by a unity government that sets the scene for democratic elections internationally monitored, and after that, whoever the Egyptian people vote for can rule the country. Let's take it to the extreme situation. Let's say the Muslim Brothers won the majority of the parliament in a free and democratic Egypt. I think what we will be seeing is an AKP style of rule, like the AKP in Turkey, not like the Iranian situation or the Iranian case. So these are, like, again, overemphasized. But what we're seeing more and more is the transformation of the Western position from the US, from saying that the Mubarak regime is a stable, friendly regime, all the way to calling for an immediate change and a transition of power. And then the Western leaders as well followed from here. There's also, but until now we're only hearing rhetoric. We saw some policies. Germany, for example, suspended arms sales to Egypt. But there's a lot more that can be done, especially on part of the U.S., where it funds the Egyptian army by 1.2 billion annually. There is also the legal dimension of this. There are hundreds of people that were killed, peaceful protesters that were killed. Thousands of them were wounded. There was a state-structured campaign, or a regime-structured campaign of violence, where you had the withdrawal of the police and the release of convicted criminals, state security men wearing as civilians and attacking peaceful protesters. All of this has legal consequences. The United States and the United Nations, the EU, can investigate this thoroughly and know the heads who gave orders to these policies to be implemented, place them on watch lists. And today, just today, I came from a group of Egyptian civil society activists who formed the Egyptian Solidarity Committee in solidarity with the democratic protesters in Egypt, and there is a subcommittee that will be dedicated for pursuing the ones who committed crimes against the Egyptian people, to pursue them legally here in the West.
How much hypocrisy do you see in the position of Western governments that in this case they are not calling for the will of the people to be immediately respected, whereas there have been numerous examples over the years of a very firm positions taken by several governments, first and foremost the US, but of course also the UK, France, Germany, where they've said time and again that leaders of countries like Zimbabwe, Belarus, Cote d'Ivoire must leave following disputed elections. Here, the Egyptian people would argue, at least some of them, that there have been several disputed elections. Just look back at the last legislative elections that took place, where the ruling NDP party is said to have gained more than 80% of the seats.
Yes, I think the West is like most other states trying to serve its interests. The regime in Egypt was quite friendly with the United States and the West. It was an ally basically, and they listened a lot more. Hosni Mubarak, came an hour and a half after John Kerry asked him to stop, to not to run in the September 2011 elections. He came out in his second speech and said that he will not run, as if whereas millions of Egyptians were calling for him to depart, and he did not hear them, but he heard John Kerry. So there is very close relations. The West has its own interests in the US, in Egypt. And there was more and more realization that those are just short-term interests with this regime. This regime is really an unpopular one. The West going closer and closer with it does not make it look that friendly to the rest of the Egyptian people. They want to avoid an Iranian-style mistake where they were quite associated and had close relations with the Shah. And after that, they lost the Iranian generations for the years to come. Now it's a critical moment, I think, in the history of Egypt. It could lead to a really democratic state, or it could lead to another military dictatorship, or the status quo can be maintained, although I don't think so, that will happen. But it's a critical moment in any case in the history of Egypt, and whatever the Western position, it will be remembered for generations to come. Until now, they are all saying the right words, but we're waiting for the right actions as well.
Omar Ashur, thanks very much for now. Let's now speak to Abdurrahman Yusuf, who's a member of the National Association for Change, which is headed by Mohammed El-Baradei, the former Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's obviously a member of the opposition. Mohammed El-Baradei, the former Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, now a key opposition figure. I understand you were in meetings today with the government. Can you tell us what happened and how many members of the opposition were there?
The meeting was held between the Prime Minister, Dr. Ahmed Shafiq, with Dr. Hamad Abulghar. I accompanied Dr. Abulghar during the meeting in order to send a message relating to the terms laid down by the National Association for Change with all its members in order to start negotiations on the political crisis in Egypt. There were two key terms. Number one, the president should delegate his powers and authorities to the Vice President Omar Suleiman and to disappear from the political arena completely, and to put Article 139 of the Constitution into effect. The second term is to acknowledge the 25th January revolution. This acknowledgement can be established in two manners. One, to release all the detainees and to identify and penalize all those who violated the law and assaulted the demonstrators. The second step the second term condition is relating to not to assault any person who took part in this revolution, whether civilian or military.
You mentioned one of your key demands being that the president delegate his authorities to the vice president. But under Article 82 of the Constitution, the president can only delegate his authorities to his vice president if he is unable to carry out his functions due to any temporary obstacle. Otherwise, he needs to delegate those authorities to the Speaker of the House. Wouldn't it be unconstitutional for him to delegate his authorities to the VP?
As a matter of fact, this is a purely legal issue which needs an answer from legal experts. We wished to convey the message after consulting with the legal expert. I cannot delve in legal details. I'm not qualified enough to do so.